further ado, tonight we are doing this hastily organized emergency meeting with Larry Everest on the situation in Ukraine. Welcome, Larry Everest.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out on such short notice, everybody. I think probably most of you are aware of how rapidly events are unfolding and how potentially extremely dangerous this whole situation is. I'm going to be talking maybe 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments. Maybe somebody from the store could give everybody a copy of the article that we wrote at Revolution, and which I will be drawing from tonight. I hope people can see the map. This is a map of Ukraine in Central Europe, and we're going to be showing some other maps as the evening goes along, and situating it. But this country, particularly over the last 2 weeks, literally a historical instance, has been convulsed by upheaval. Kyiv, or Kiev, with the star as the capital, in the city of Kiev between February 23rd and February 18th and the 23rd, there were street protests, there was firing by the government against the protesters, there were deals signed, there were deals broken, the regime of Viktor Yanukovych imploded, he fled to Russia next door, and as this has been going on, what has really come to the fore and was actually in the background leading up to this was a very sharp geopolitical contention and rivalry between the world's great powers, mainly the United States and the European Union on one side, although they have conflicts amongst themselves as well, and Russia on the other side. And within days of the fall of Yanukovych, the Russians put their military on alert, and then in the last several days, I think where's my New York Times headline here? Sunday, March 2nd, Kremlin deploys military to seize Crimea. Now, Crimea is the little peninsula. You see Sevastopol right there. Can people see that? That's the part that is now under Russian control. They have a naval base there, and they have a number of other military bases. My understanding is that the troops there came from those bases, whereas there's 150,000 Russian troops close to the border. And the eastern part of Ukraine is perhaps majority, or at least quite a few Russian speakers. I'm not going to try to get into the internal demographics that much tonight, but that's the situation. And in response, you know, there have been very sharp statements by the United States denouncing this as an act of aggression. It won't stand. There's talk of cutting off military and economic relations, imposing sanctions, and so on. Today, Kerry was in Kiev, and you know, promising aid and denouncing it, supporting the new government, and so on. And what we're seeing right now is the highest level of tension. Some people have said since the dismemberment or collapse of Yugoslavia, but certainly I would think since the end of the Cold War, since 1991. And we're in a situation where events are unfolding quickly and to some degree unpredictably. There are many different actors involved here. This all isn't just being stage managed by the US and Russia, even as, yes, they're the dominant players in this drama. And I heard one commentator describe it as extremely dangerous because what seems impossible today seems like a rational choice a week from now. So there is the real possibility of a direct great power confrontation. I'm not saying it's a certainty or even probable, but this is certainly the situation we're faced with, and it's very urgent we understand it. And I think that we have to understand this in the context, and I'll be getting into this in the talk, of what we at Revolution call shifting tectonic plates of global economic, political, and military strength that are shaking the post-World War II order. In other words, the U.S. has been the dominant imperialist power, and sort of, the world order has had a certain structure to it since 1945. And in certain ways, obviously, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a gigantic shift there, although it didn't, it left the U.S. Unchallenged. But those tectonic plates are moving very quickly, and with a kind of potential for something to suddenly seeming to erupt out of nowhere, like this battle in Kiev, and have profound global repercussions. But I want to start out with the importance of us understanding what is actually going on, because the lies, the hypocrisy, the distortions, the double talk are flying fast and furious. I'm going to focus on the U.S. here. If we were in Russia, I could say the same thing about the Russian government. But we have a particular responsibility living in the belly of the proverbial beast here to understand and expose the actions of, quote, our own rulers in the context of the crimes and aggression they're committing, while also understanding in a truthful and factual way what all the players are doing. And look, I could spend all night on this. Every time I turn on a TV, I'm just like, what did that person just say? What bald-faced lie did that person just say? I'm going to limit myself to a couple of things. I just picked out today's New York Times, the op-ed page. You could do it with any television show or NPR, whatever. You could do the same thing. Today's New York Times. Roger Cohen, a columnist, has an article, Putin's Crimea Crime, right? And the first thing that struck me about this is for the invasion, which he denounces as a violation of international law, because international law stipulates the only just war. And look, I'm not a proponent of, I'm not going to debate the merits and demerits of current international law, but just to, this is what these powers supposedly go by. Either UN Security Council approval or legitimate self-defense, neither of which was operative in this case. So Cohen denounces this as an act of aggression and a crime. And my first thought was, when do U.S. actions ever get called crimes? Even if people oppose the Iraq War, which was one of the most blatant acts of naked aggression that you could imagine, even those within the ruling class who opposed it would not have been able in the pages of the New York Times to call it a crime. You see, this is how they're training people, is what the other people do are crimes. Yeah, we make mistakes, and, we're well-meaning, and, they're training people to think in this way. And then the other one is David Brooks, Putin Can't Stop. And it's a description of this sort of traditional and somewhat obscurantist and great Russian chauvinist ideology that Putin has developed and is emphasizing to try to cohere the Russian state, which, like the U.S., is an imperialist country. This is a capitalist imperialist country, two imperialists clashing. So Brooks is Brooks is basically making an argument that this is quasi-religious nationalism and on a whole other level of detachment from reality. So I finished this article and I think, wow, he's never heard of American exceptionalism and the law that says if you're the president of the United States, you have to end every speech with "God bless America." And, essentially God is on the side of the United States. But no, that's not religious, quasi-fascistic religious nationalism, And we can talk about Kerry, who voted for the invasion of Iraq, condemning the invasion of Crimea as a naked act of aggression. Well, what is it when the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq? And let's remember, and again, I'm not a proponent of Russian imperialism, no one's been killed by Russian forces to this point. That could change. No one's been killed. The toll of the war in Iraq, which I document in my book, which should be around here someplace, between 500,000 and 1 million Iraqis dead, over 4 million million people driven from their home. And a civil war that's unleashed that's ripping Iraq apart and killing dozens of people every other day. This is what the United States brought to the people of Iraq. So my point is that people are being systematically lied to. This isn't a matter of ignorance or simple arrogance or whatever. This is a very deliberate and systematic effort to train people to see things through the eyes of the U.S. empire and its rulers. And of course, we could go through what Putin's saying as well. So what I want to get into tonight mainly is what's really going on here. What is actually at work in this crisis? How it points to the bankruptcy of the current dominant political order and economic order around the world, and the urgent need and possibility, and I stress possibility, of working for revolution to bring an entirely different economic and political system into being and an entirely different world, which is so urgently needed. Well, one thing that Obama has been emphasizing is that U.S. actions in Ukraine are motivated by America's desire to support the people of the Ukraine and their ability to determine their own future. Remember that one, because these are lies. And again, until people learn to understand not simply that they're lies, but what the actual interests are and the motives are behind what is happening, they're going to be suckered and bamboozled and whipped one way or another by the powers that be. What is happening in Ukraine is not in essence a popular, with any complex phenomenon, there's a lot of different things at play. But we're talking about what's the essence of it, what's the core of it. It's not a popular revolt. There's been no revolution in Ukraine. It's not a battle between oligarchs and Democrats. It's not the march of democracy brushing aside the remnants of Soviet kleptocracy or Soviet autocracy. What's involved is a battle within the Ukrainian ruling class, a monopoly capitalist ruling class. I'll have more to say about oligarchs in a minute. That is very closely connected up with and inextricably bound and largely shaped by the rivalry between the U.S. imperialism and the European Union on one side and Russian imperialism on the other side. And it's in this context that different sections of the Ukrainian people are being whipped up and manipulated and used to serve reactionary aims. So right now, the whole framework of how this conflict is playing out, and I'm not saying it has to stay that way, but the framework of this, nothing good can come out of this. It's not going to be good if the U.S. prevails. It's not going to be good if Russia prevails. So I want to give a little background on Ukraine. It's a country of, and if we could have the next slide. It's a country of 45 million people. It's very rich agriculturally, relatively developed industrially, and you can see that it's in a very strategic location. It's a buffer state for Russia. It's also, abuts the Black Sea, which is the one way that Russia has. This is why they have a naval base right here. It's the one warm water port year-round that Russia has. It's where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is headquarters, and it's the means by which the Russian Navy can come into the Mediterranean and then the Atlantic or the Pacific. And, on Ukraine, I have one slide that shows you oil pipelines going all across Ukraine from Russia into Europe. It's also something of a gateway to the Middle East. So this is a very strategically important. During World War II, Hitler invaded Ukraine on the way to try to seize oil fields there and in Russia and to attempt to defeat the Soviet Union at Stalingrad. So this is a very important piece of real estate. Ukraine first emerged as a coherent country in the 17th century. By the late 1700s, it was part of the Tsarist Empire, the reactionary Russian Empire, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, those folks. As long as much of the rest of the East here. In 1917, when during World War I, which was also, let's not forget, an imperialist war over who would dominate Europe and the world, echoes of that right now. The czars were overthrown, first in February and then by the Bolsheviks in a communist revolution in November 1917. And Ukraine was very much part of this. There were Bolsheviks and revolutionaries in Ukraine, and I'm not going to rehearse that whole history right now, but basically something brand new was being born that was a break from imperialism, was the creation of the first multinational state based on equality between different nations and respecting the rights of minorities within the different nations. Ukraine was part of that. There was a complicated civil war and revolution. The Bolsheviks in Ukraine won, and in 1922, they joined the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now that remained a socialist state until the mid-1950s, at which point we assessed that state capitalism had been restored. And then why don't you go to the next slide, I think, of the... so from 1956, say, up till 1991, this was the configuration in Eastern Europe. All these countries were part of the Soviet bloc. This is the Warsaw Pact countries. And in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. These different countries, and see in this, it's this map's actually incorrect because they should have these other republics, even as they were part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which the Eastern European countries were not. There should still be borders drawn where Ukraine is. See, Ukraine's right in here, and Belarus, and the Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. But in any case, this was a configuration till 1991, and then the Soviet Union collapsed. These states, they were independent before. There was no longer a Warsaw Pact, and some of the other states became independent. And you know there have been different divisions of these states, Czechoslovakia and so on. And I would, again, I'm not going to try to go into that very complicated history. I just wanted to give people a sense of what it was. But this is the issue that Reiko was mentioning. You don't know what you think you know about the communist revolution and the real path to emancipation. Its history and our future, and it's really urgent that people know this history because the Russian Revolution was the first instance of the oppressed standing up and actually winning victory in a revolution and creating an entirely new kind of political and economic system. And of course there were contradictions within that. That's what's gone into in this issue. So I'm not trying to cover that complexity. But the important thing to understand is that after 1991, the U.S. was left the world's sole imperialist superpower. And their explicit strategy, and this is people like Rumsfeld, Wolf, this is George H.W. Bush, the first Bush administration. And again, this is something I document in my book. They saw that this was an incredible victory for the U.S. The U.S. was, at that point, an unchallenged global superpower. And U.S. strategy, the core of U.S. strategy ever since then, has been to not allow any other power or constellation of powers to rise to challenge it in a frontal and all-around way, as had been the case with the Soviet Union between the mid-1950s and 1989, 1991 when it collapsed. Remember, they were head-to-head all around the world. There was a real danger of nuclear war during this so-called Cold War. Really, it should be a cold imperialist war, which is more what it was. So the U.S. strategy has been, especially a country like Russia, and now they're turning their focus to China as well, to prevent Russia from re-emerging with the strength the Soviet Union had. And a big part of this strategy has been, and why don't you go to the next slide, just remember what this is. All these countries have now been absorbed into NATO, the U.S. military alliance. So NATO is knocking closer and closer to the Russian borders. The strategy is to hem Russia in so it cannot regain that strength. And that's what's going on here in the Ukraine. And why don't you do the next slide? And the other, on the economic front, you can see this is the expansion of the European Union, which puts these states much more directly under the umbrella and integrated into European and global US-dominated imperialism, and weakens, and again is a move toward weakening Russia, because remember, all this was also part of an economic bloc when it was part of the Soviet Union. So this has been the US strategy, and the Russian imperialist strategy to counter this. Russia realizes it's not in a position to directly challenge the United States in a frontal way. It simply does not have the strength to do that. But a big focus of what Russia has done is to try to protect and extend what it calls its near abroad. In other words, the states right on its border, particularly to the south. This is why Russia in 2008 invaded the state of Georgia. It's not on this map, but it's down in this area. Belarus has been integrated into a Russian customs union. And this was the overall Russian objective in Ukraine, to at the very least prevent Ukraine from being fully absorbed into the Western Bloc, but to maintain either Russian predominance or at least a good deal of leverage and not a direct military into Ukraine. Why don't you go to the next slide? And look, this is the Shanghai, and look, these other powers, I just want to mention this because what's going on, I mentioned shifting fault lines, tectonic plates. Countries like China and to some degree Iran, to some degree India and Russia, are trying to work to build strength independent from the U.S. and to work, the U.S. has been absorbed in Afghanistan and the Middle East and so on, and this has given these countries, as well as the rise of energy prices, which is also a big Soviet geopolitical weapon. It's the world's largest exporter of energy. And it's been used against Ukraine as an economic weapon. In 2006, they cut off oil. But this is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which this isn't. I don't want to say this has it does not have the strength of a NATO or a European Union or so on. I don't want to exaggerate this, but you can see this is an effort by these states to contend. And if you could go to the next one, this is what the Russian-led Eurasian Customs Union, this is what Russia wanted Ukraine to be part of. Now, this doesn't include China, Belarus, Kazakhstan, some of the Central Asian republics. This is what Russia wanted Ukraine to be part of, and which the US and the EU threw down around and said, no, if you take IMF aid, that's the way to go. Not part of this. Do not sign this deal. So, So this struggle, I'm not going to go through the whole history of it. There was an Orange Revolution in 2004 that brought pro-U.S. forces to power. There was a counter moves by Russia, including cutting off the natural gas that I talked about. And a lot of this came to a head in the last 3 months since November. That's a point at which then President Yanukovych said he wanted to postpone signing a deal with the EU and sign an agreement with Russia instead. Russia had promised cheaper oil and $15 billion in aid. Remember, Ukraine, like much of the world, is in an extremely fraught economic situation, probably more than many other countries. But look at, there's a lot of stress and strain in the global capitalist system and financial system. Think about Greece and Portugal and Spain. Well, much the same thing has been happening in the Ukraine. There's a tremendous amount of economic distress. They're way in debt. They're clamoring for aid and so on. So in November, they signed this deal with Russia, asked the U.S., it told the EU they wanted to postpone that decision. Reportedly, Russia did not attach quite the same strings that the EU did to signing a deal with Russia. In other words, if they were part of this, it wouldn't, from the Russian point of view, exclude participation in some of the European aid and so on. But this was, seen as a huge affront and angered the U.S. and the European Union, which were really trying to make a geopolitical coup out of what happened here. There was a guy in the New York Times short before all the military maneuvers that was claiming that the events that removed Yanukovych from power represented a fundamental shift of Ukraine toward the West. So between November and February, U.S. officials were going over to Kiev and to Ukraine and openly encouraging and supporting and rallying on the opposition. I mean, just think about it. What if Putin flew to New York and went down to Occupy Wall Street and said, you people have the might of Russia behind you. Keep going. Fight the police. Don't listen to these people. They're all illegitimate. We're broadcasting it. Can you imagine? I mean, please, come on. This would have been screams of outrage and, high dudgeon here about this is so. And I just have to say as well, during this time in early February as this was going on, let's remember Obama, will of the Ukrainian people, interests of the Ukrainian people. Well, a phone call between Victoria Nuland, people have probably heard about this, and the U.S. ambassador was intercepted. And, you people thought only the U.S. should be able to spy. I guess others don't think that, So they intercepted this phone call, and Nuland and the ambassador are discussing who should rule Ukraine. So I don't think the ambassador to Ukraine, the U.S. ambassador. U.S. ambassador Victoria Nuland, I think, is an assistant secretary of state, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think Klitsch. I think it's Klitschko, if I'm getting the guy's name right. He's the boxer, big, tall dude, very close to Germany. I don't think he should go in the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea. I think Yats is the guy. They're talking about Yatsenyuk, who is now the prime minister. He's the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, What he needs is Klitsch and another gentleman on the outside, And it's in this conversation that she says, fuck the EU. And I think, there's also rivalry there between particularly Germany and the U.S. Again, not in a frontal way, but the degree of influence, benefit, and control in Europe in particular. And there's still some of those tensions in the New York Times today, there was on the business page, I don't know if people saw this, but there was a big article about Germany's economic ties with Russia and the importance of any German role in trying to negotiate this. So anyway, just keep in mind, again, can you imagine during the budget shutdown if the Chinese were, donated $100 million to try to sway the elections so that the one faction or another would win? Oh, I'm sorry, that already happened, and they put some people in jail over that here. So this is the raw hypocrisy that's going on, and the very, very bitter rivalry. I want to wrap up by, in a certain way, the two most important things to get into. And that is, where does all this come from? And what do we do about it? Because this is another level. It isn't just that the rulers lie about factual matters. That isn't actually the most damaging thing. It's lying about causes and what are the actual motivations going on. Because none of this stems from Putin. He's the demon of the month, the flavor of the month, right? The ritual demonization. Putin, 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 as if this one individual was the cause of all. They're great about this with Hitler. 99% of the people probably you ask on the street know Hitler was bad, but they wouldn't know he was a capitalist and that's why he did what he did. And the same thing is going on here. This quote from Basics, I always go back to this because if people understood this, they'd look at all this entirely differently. The essence of what exists in the U.S., and we could put Russia in there as well, is not democracy but capitalism, imperialism, and political structures to enforce that capitalism, imperialism. What the U.S. spreads around the world is not democracy, but imperialism and political structures to enforce that imperialism. In other words, that's what they're trying to usher in the Ukraine right now, a political structure that supports the interests and objectives of capitalism, imperialism. And the essence of what exists in the U.S. isn't what you vote for. It isn't what person happens to be in the White House. The state and the political system are political structures to enforce capitalism, imperialism. That's what they are. And of course, they have lots of debate and struggle over just exactly how to do that, but that's what it is. And the point here is that the economic system and the means of producing the stuff of life is the foundation of any society. And under capitalism, this operates in certain very particular ways and in accord with economic laws which have gravitational force. In other words, this is how this system works. And this is, as Raymond Lotta has described it, it's a competitive urging to produce profit and more profit as a matter of individual capitalist survival. Not greed, but competitive survival. And that profit is produced on the basis of the exploitation of wage labor. Capitalism is driven by the competitive imperative to expand or die. And you can look in the tech industry and see who's eating up who, and is Microsoft going to be subsumed under Google, or this is a very, very wait, what happened to Kmart? I thought they were gigantic. Oops, they're gone. We can't even remember them anymore. So there's a real life and death competitive battle. And capitalism at this time in history has evolved into global capitalism. It operates globally, or global capitalism, imperialism. And what that means is these different nationally anchored blocks of capital, like in the US, are compelled to seek profitable investment around the world, labor to exploit, resources to exploit, markets to control, and all that. And this sets the stage for a political military battle to control different spheres of interest and different parts of the world. This isn't about, well, we have the US military invade Iraq because Halliburton wants contracts. This is something that's done in the overall interests of US capital. And this is what is driving this. You know, the political military struggle has dynamics of its own, but it's on this foundation. And we can see this playing out pretty nakedly with the Russian pipelines from the East and from the IMF dealings trying to get its control of Ukraine and integrate it more profitably into what the West is doing. And I just think, and look, one thing that just really strikes me in all this is that, you know, there's all this talk of Ukrainian oligarchs, right? Oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs. I was driving around yesterday and I heard a news report that Bill Gates had just been, Forbes just declared him the most wealthy man in the world. He had a fortune of $76 billion. But he's not an oligarch, though. He's an entrepreneur. Just remember that, right? In fact, they don't even call him a capitalist, right? And look, who are these so-called oligarchs that are being talked about from? They're just monopoly capitalists. They're fully integrated into the global economic system, playing by more or less the same rules that Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, you know, Apple, so on and so on. You know, but again, by the choice of words, they're you know, trying to basically train people not to understand the systems that are actually involved in this. But the other point that the other two things I wanted to mention briefly, and look, let's remember, whenever the U.S. says our national interest this, our national interest that, or Russia says the same thing, or Germany, they're talking about imperialist interests. And you know, going back earlier, 1914 to 1918, World War I, then World War II, 1939 to 1945, imperialist wars. The Soviet Union looked like that against the U.S., that could be World War III, but the Soviet Union collapsed, didn't happen. And so, you know, there's supposedly you know, a lot of the people like Obama have been saying, well, look, the Cold War is over. We're not going back to the Cold War, as if you know, the threat of a global war is receded. We're so much better than that now. You know, democracy is triumphing and yada, yada, yada. And then here we are, you know, here we are with Russian troops with what can legitimately be called, at least in large part, a US-EU instigated coup. Then Russian troops coming in to Crimea. There is talk of Ukraine wanting to be part of NATO, which would obligate the US to go to war over Ukraine. Ukraine is not in NATO, but there's also talk of Stephen Cohen, he's a professor of Russian history, said, what happens if Poland masses troops or calls for NATO troops on its border with Ukraine. Well, this can set in motion, or what if the extreme right comes to power, and they're part of the government, the Svoboda party is part of the new government, and, instigates armed conflict against Russian forces. You see, this is really, so when Obama says that Russia's on the wrong side of history, my thought is no, imperialism's on the wrong side of history. We got to get beyond a system that's plundering the entire earth, threatening the fabric of life on earth environmentally, and is now threatening to plunge the world, if not this time, the next turn of the screw into some sort of a global conflict with which would end up who knows where. But but there's a lot we can do in this situation. People aren't helpless, but for people not to be helpless, in fact, what is happening here shows you that the existing order is not permanent, that things can happen very quickly. I think George Shultz, the former Reagan Secretary of State, calls the situation a world awash in change because things are happening so fast. Der Spiegel, a German newspaper, called what's happening in Ukraine a chess game in a minefield, and so these things can break down, but the only way that people are going to be act in a way that's going to lead to someplace good is if they have leadership that understands what the problem is and what the solution is and how to actually get there. I don't know if people have seen the movie The Square about Egypt, the protests in Egypt. It's heartbreaking because these young people are so courageous. They go out and risk their lives day after day, overthrow Mubarak, then elect Morsi. And by the way, the U.S. didn't have any problem with the Egyptian military massacring a bunch of Muslim brothers and overthrowing the elected government of Mohammed Morsi. Whoa, wait a minute, what happened to the will of the Egyptian people? But they had no leadership, so they go from Mubarak to a reactionary Muslim Brotherhood, and now they're back with the military. It's heartbreaking. And we do have this kind of leadership. And one of the things people need to do is find out about this. This is why we emphasize the work of Bob Avakian, because he's developed a new synthesis of communism and a strategy for revolution. This is why we're doing a big fundraising campaign so millions of people can know about this and engage it. As Reiko was saying, some of the things I would point to are the film Revolution, Nothing Less, very important. This Constitution for a New Socialist Republic of North America, the book Basics. People need to get into this and explore this, and we need to be fighting the power and transforming the people for revolution, to be prepared for a time like this, which is going to come unexpectedly, when there's the leadership that can lead millions of people to oppose the crimes of imperialism and to bring a better world into birth. And one of the things that we can do as we're doing all that is, A, protest any kind of U.S. military threat to get involved. And because we're protesting what the U.S. does not mean we support Russian imperialism either. But we know that nothing good's going to come from whatever the U.S. or NATO is doing. And the other thing I would really urge everybody to do is to get an email or a print subscription to Revolution. We cover these things every week, and revcom.us, and you know, you're going to get a perspective and analysis and be part of a movement that's radically different than anything else out there. So thank you.
So I would just like to pass the hat or the basket and encourage everyone to contribute to the bookstore. We survive in large part based on donations, and more we're seeing that this is the way to go forward to save Revolution books through this crisis of independent bookstores going out of business. We're not going down like that. If you want to have a bookstore like Revolution Books, having the literature that it does, the viewpoint that it gives, and the events here, while the world is awash in the winds of change or whatever that was, then I encourage you to give what you can, and especially tonight, I would encourage you to buy a ticket for this benefit that we're having next week, a chance to see these world-class poets in the context of Revolution Books and how they view what is going on in the world and their role within it. So with that said, I guess Larry's going to call on people to
Comments, questions? It's great. I get to pay to speak at Revolution. Oh, donate. I didn't have to pay.
So my question is, what is the pact with, like, what countries are with Russia? Like, so obviously there's NATO, which is like more the Western European and U.S. And then what is Russia, like, what other countries are like you were kind of talking about that earlier, but could you emphasize it?
Okay. Why don't we do two things? Let's get a few comments or questions, number one. And number two, I know that there are people here who, who have things to say about this. So, I'm not hopefully I have some of the answers, and I will certainly not shy about giving those answers, but I hope other people should also, feel, should weigh in, either to comment, to speak to a question, to ask a question. So why don't we get a couple more, and then we can try to, yeah, go ahead, right behind you, man.
Well, this crisis happens in this context that you're talking about of the conflicting strategic needs, and then something comes up within that context. Is there also something happening in the world overall that this is the time that it's happening because of things going on outside of that contention?
Good question. It relates to what he just asked. Anybody else want to pitch in?
I have a quick, stupid question. Is
question
China involved in this?
That's
somehow?
not a stupid question at all. That's a good question. And look, here's the other thing. Of course, if people have a different analysis, feel free to raise that as well. We relish engagement here at Revolution Books. So, well, let me just take a stab. These are all three related questions. If you go back to 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've identified this as a period of transition with a potential for great upheaval. And this has gone through, obviously, the collapse of the Soviet Union led to an enormous acceleration of globalization, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people being, China turned into a sweatshop of the world, and, these tremendous migrations. Now we're at a point where the majority of people on Earth live in cities for the first time. New powers have risen in different ways. So this has been going on, and it's been going on in the way it's gone on because of the anarchic operation of capitalism. In other words, I described a system of private ownership in which capitalists are competing against each other, and there is no master plan. You see, so all this development is anarchic. And, you know, the whole 2001, 9/11, you know, war on terror represented another big development in which the U.S. has been embroiled in wars for 13 years, to try to reshape the entire Middle East with not working out as planned. You know, that's embroiled them. There was a 2008 financial crisis, which was a very big jolt. And at that point, Raymond Lotta wrote a very important series of articles. Let's see, it's called Shifting Fault Lines. I can't remember the exact, where is it? Shifts and Fault Lines. Shifts and fault lines in the world economy and great power rivalry, what is happening and what it might mean. And in that series, which this is why I encourage people to go to RevCom, because that's where it is. One of the main things he documents is the decline of U.S. economic strength relative to other countries. I think in the 50s, the U.S. had 50% of global GDP something, and now it's 20%. And there's been a major and dramatic shift of manufacturing to Asia, particularly to China. I mean, just think of all the electronics we consume. They're not made here, you know. They're made there. So in that context, and again, I'm simplifying here, one of the themes of what Lotta was writing was that there are these powers that are arising, particularly China, but also the European Union and Russia, that while not frontally confronting the U.S. in the way that happened in the Cold War, or you know, World War II, the Axis versus the Allies, you know, where two blocks are just going straight head to head, there was nonetheless competition and contention that were going on, and there was the potential of the formation of blocks that may rival the U.S., and in any case, this was something the U.S. was increasingly having to deal with. So what we're seeing today is an escalation and development of what Lotta was describing in 2008. An intensification of inter-imperialist rivalry and any number of contradictions in the world. And I mean, it's interesting on China. I showed the picture of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but I just heard on the news today that China, while not fully in Russia's camp and not, you know, is opposed to, is basically supporting Russia's position in Crimea, you know, from what I understand. And just take a look at the sharpness of the conflicts in the Pacific between the Philippines and Japan on one side and China on the other, in which the president of the Philippines was talking about World War I. You know, again, I'm not arguing we're on the verge of World War III, but that's the sharpness of the contradiction. So I don't think, you know, China is not, from what I understand, playing a very active role in it, but they are a UN Security Council member. They can have a veto. You know, if it came to be that Europe and the US tried to introduce a resolution, you know, of some sort, it could be Russia and China would veto that. I mean, I think that's sort of the terrain, shifting terrain. I hope that answers the question, or sort of answers it. I mean, obviously there's a lot more to that. But did you want to say, tell us some of the Eastern European you're not, you don't need to, but.
Yeah. Excuse me. I'm happy to do that. I just need to try and limit what I say because I have so much to say.
Well, if you could, take a few minutes though. You know.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of what's the most important to convey. So I've been living in the Czech Republic for the last couple of years, and I was married to a guy there who was very actively involved in political issues on the left. So I know a lot about that whole scene and went to lots of meetings there that remind me very much of this meeting. And, have heard their whole analysis. And of course, they're coming from the perspective of having lived under the Soviet domination for a very long time. And then their kind of revolutionary activists were the ones who were trying to throw off the yoke of the Soviet Union. And eventually they had their Velvet Revolution in 1989. And came out of that, and people were elated, and they thought they could do everything and anything that they wanted at that point in time, and they didn't realize how badly things were going to disintegrate. They didn't realize the future that was staring them in the face.
Right.
What is going on in Ukraine is also going on in other Central and Eastern European countries in terms of economic breakdown. After the Soviet Union left and broke apart, and the countries kind of nominally were heading in the direction of free market capitalism. They no longer had the social safety net that had been in place before. Just speaking from the perspective of the Czech Republic, which at that time was Czechoslovakia, now it's divided off from Slovakia, there was compulsory employment. Everyone had to have a job, unless you could certify that you had some, physical reason why you couldn't work. You had to have a job, but on the other hand, a job was provided for you, so there was full employment. There was full protection of social securities and social benefits. Everyone had housing. There was no one who was homeless. Everyone had an income. Everyone had health care. Everyone had education. All those things were provided for. What people were angry about and fought against was that they didn't feel that they had freedoms. They weren't allowed to travel freely. They weren't allowed to freely have access to Western cultural things, music and the arts and literature and so forth. So they were very resentful about that. And they didn't really think very much about the good things that they did have. Since 1989, the poverty rate just skyrocketed across all of the former Soviet states and Central and Eastern Europe. So poverty went way up. Inequality went from being extremely low in these countries to being very, very high. Of course, it starts out as economic inequality, but then this begins to translate into social inequality, because when people are in different economic classes, they start living differently. They can't go to the same schools. They can't take advantage of the same kinds of opportunities at any level, and so they start to develop social differences as well, and social classes. So things have really been going downhill. And then you couple that with the huge crisis, economic crisis that took place in the European Union a couple years after the one that started in 2008 here in the US. And then you start to get situations of complete economic breakdown, such as in Greece and Portugal and Ireland and so forth, and now Spain. That's also happening in Central and Eastern Europe. It's just maybe a little bit slower and maybe not quite so obvious, because they were not very well-to-do to begin with. People were very equal and life was very stable, but people didn't have very much. And now there are some people who have a lot. So if you just kind of look at it casually, you might think, well, things are quite a bit better now, because you can see some evidences of wealth and people doing innovative and creative things. But now there's a very high level of risk. Now people can lose their jobs. They can be unemployed. Now there are homeless people. There are people without health care. There are elderly people who are losing their homes, who don't have adequate pensions. So things are really degenerating. And I'm making a point, and I'm almost done.
No, this is interesting.
What's happening is that people are very afraid. This, some people are aware that they're afraid and they're talking about it, but most people really aren't. They just feel very insecure because they don't know what their future holds for them. If they're older people, they're afraid of surviving during their old age because the safety net is no longer there. If they're young people, they feel hopeless about their future. And so now there's a huge rise of drug addictions and young people who basically kind of just hang around and don't do anything. And that's as much hopelessness as it is a poor economy. So things are really bad. Obviously, they're very bad in the Ukraine. They're also extremely bad in Bulgaria. There have been massive protests and demonstrations in Bulgaria. They're not quite as bad in the Czech Republic, but they're heading in that direction. A year ago, so it's almost 2 years ago now, in April of 2012, there was the largest demonstration in Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic, since the days of protest against the Soviet Union. There were 100,000 people at the demonstration there. And speaker after speaker got up and talked about the situation and how dangerous things were and how people were losing their safety and their security in life.
What was their demand of the demos? What was the demo?
So what their demand was to reverse the so-called economic reforms that had been imposed by the European Union or demanded in return for receiving loans, IMF loans and loans from the EU. And so they wanted to reverse these, they call them reforms, which is of course a horrible misnomer, but it means things like all kinds of privatization of different businesses and industries, making people pay fees to get higher education, ending nationalized health care so that people have to start paying for their own health insurance and their own health, reducing the pensions for older people to the point where people can no longer live off of them, and so forth. So people were demanding a reversal of those so-called reforms. I can talk for hours about what happened after that. It was a massive demonstration that represented a large fraction of the population of the country, 100,000 people in a small country. The government was terrified. They thought they were about to be toppled, just like what happened in Ukraine. And then because of some really nasty backroom dealings between the labor unions and some corrupt government officials, the whole thing kind of got swept under the carpet, I'm sorry to say. But what I'm trying to say is that this situation we're seeing in the Ukraine could happen in Bulgaria, it could happen in the Czech Republic, it could probably happen in Hungary too. There's a huge amount of unrest there. So this is not just Ukraine. What's different in Ukraine is that there's still a large component of the population that feels favorably toward the Russians. In the Czech Republic, the Russians are almost uniformly hated. There isn't the cultural tie that makes people feel fond there. They just see them as someone who had invaded or oppressed them.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But there's a lot more to say, but I'm going to stop.
Well, no,
now.
it's very interesting and important. I just, I would just, this point you're making about the economic suffering and deprivation. I mean, all of this, and your point on the IMF, I mean, they call it IMF aid. What was it, Institute of Misery and Famine, not the International Monetary Fund, because as she's saying, all these aids come with very stringent conditions, which are about what? Making capital more profitable. How do you do that? You slash people's living standards and anything that doesn't directly turn a profit, which we're seeing in this country. Not perhaps to the degree, but because this is an imperialist power that survives because Chinese workers or workers in Bangladesh get $30 a month, you know. I mean, this is where the wealth of this country comes from. And so I think that's an important thing. It's very interesting. And even with the Ukraine, there's a certain amount of debate saying Ukraine's a basket case, let's give it to Russia, or Ukraine's a basket case, they would be smart to let it sink the West, you know. I mean, that's not really what's happening so far, but it shows you how dire the situation is. The other thing I think is important here, you know, just what you're describing, look, in Eastern Europe, after you know, this is why this new synthesis of communism is so important, because, you know, the whole history, in other words, I'm sure I would have been revolting if I lived in Eastern Europe against the Soviet Union. It was an oppressive imperialist power by the mid-50s, you know? I mean, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Eastern Europe, I'm not, but for the most part there wasn't. Ukraine, you had a genuine revolutionary uprising in 1917 to 20. That's a different circumstance than in Eastern Europe, where in a lot of ways socialism was imposed by Soviet troops. You know, a different matter. And certainly, look, the people of Ukraine have many legitimate grievances, you know, and have every reason to be angry. But look at, so far, they're bouncing between one oligarch and another. I mean, this new regime has plenty of oligarchs. Some of them switch sides right in the middle of the thing. So it's not like, oh, that old Yanukovych regime, those are the oligarchs. No, they've got their whole list of, and Timoshenko, the woman, I mean, she's an oligarch, you know, she's a monopoly capitalist. But, you know, this is the problem in Eastern Europe is people bought into the thing that socialism was the failure. No, socialism was defeated. And what you're experiencing is imperialism, you know. But then sorting out what happened in all these different revolutions. What about Stalin? What about his role? What about Lenin? What about Mao? How do we, you know, sum all that up, including the fact that it was overwhelmingly a radical, liberating break, unprecedented in human history. Yet, at the same time, and I'm not going to go on about this, but this is why this issue on the history of communism is so vital. At the same time, the Avakian's work is, you know, how do we scientifically understand this? What were they trying to do? What shortcomings were there in their understanding and conception? And how do we learn from what was positive, but also do better, you know, and you know, in a nutshell, how do we do those things that you talked about, guaranteeing the basic needs of the masses of people without, in a sustainable way environmentally, B, on an internationalist basis, so it isn't just about your country and what benefits you're going to have, and how do you do it without turning out the lights of intellectual discourse and artistic creativity? And this new synthesis is really, you know, it's kind of not a wheel with a hub and spokes. It's more, the metaphor is solid core with a lot of elasticity. So there's a lot more nonlinear divergence and ferment going on, because you realize it's not as throwing a bone to the liberals or something. It's because if you don't have that kind of atmosphere, you're not going to overcome class division and the division. You're not going to get at the truth. So that's what this new synthesis is about. And I know there's a manifesto for a new stage of communism up there that's been translated into different languages. And I wish people in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, all over the world could know about this. Right now, I think, what is it, people from 161 countries visit RevCom, you know, the website. But I wish people there had access to this new synthesis, because really what it comes down to is you have two choices. They're this huge socialized, interconnected, highly technological web of production that gives humanity the capacity to, you know, to give everyone a decent life. I mean, there's tremendous technological and productive capacity. The problem is it's owned and controlled privately for pursuing profit. So, you know, your choice is capitalism or socialism and ultimately communism. In other words, you either have private ownership or ownership in the interests of humanity. And those are the two choices, but then, you know, overcoming all those centuries of oppression and different sorts of social women, the oppression of women, you know, in this country, the oppression of black people and, you know, all of it, you know, of course, is a protracted struggle. But this is something that is so important, because I thought your point is, you know, storms are coming. The question is there a way out? And there is. There is. If you read this Constitution for a New Socialist Republic, it's a very exciting, and if you read about the actual achievements, particularly in China, but also in the first years of the Russian Revolution and the things that they were, you know, I mean, everybody's talking about the Ukraine and, you know, the divisions between nationalities. This was the very first state that not only broke out of an imperialist war, which is why the imperialists were so outraged. And in all this talk about the history of the Ukraine, they don't mention the fact that after the Russian Revolution, I think it was either 14 or 18 countries invaded Russia to try to crush the revolution. They forgot, and it was in the course of this civil war and fighting the old regime and these foreign armies that the revolution got, you know, ended up being victorious. But that was one of the first things this new Soviet republic did, and founded and made a constitution based on equality of nations, you know. So there were, you know, and this is at a time in America where they were lynching black people, and the notion that black people were equal to white people was just considered ridiculous. You know, the culture of America was birth of a nation, you know. So anyway, I'm going on. So, but I think, and look, and the argument about this new synthesis and working through this knotty history and you know, is very important. It's the engagement and struggle over this. Wither humanity. How does humanity get to a whole other place? You know, and having a lot of different people engage in that, you know, I think is really critical. So yeah, you had a thing. Yo.
Okay. Yeah.
Don't be daydreaming when you get called on, all right?
I didn't know when you were going to stop.
That is hard to know, isn't it? I try to sort of not be obvious about that.
No, I just this was very rich. I mean, one, the way you were starting it out about how they couch all these terms about what's going on in the world in a way that, you know, points us in the wrong direction, brainwashes us, all this. And then what she was saying about, you know, the world is a horror, truly a horror, you know, and some places you know about. But, you know, I didn't really know what was going on in Bulgaria or Poland or the Czech Republic in terms of, I mean, what you say about, you know, it reminds me of that movie, Goodbye Lenin, you know? with
That
East Germany, yeah,
right.
when
right,
they
right.
try to convince his old mother that it's still this DDR and Kansas. Well, anyway, but the social net just being stripped out from under people, you know, and the absolute misery, and I can imagine the terror of people who all their lives, you know, they lived a very menial and very like gray life, but at least they were supported, and all this being ripped away from them. And it just, you know, you think about like the revolution, or you know, the upsurge in Tunisia, and it wasn't until that thing really got going that they started talking about what were the conditions of the Tunisian people, you know, the youth, or the same in Egypt, or the same in Algeria, you know. But it was always like, what are they after? They're after our freedom, you know? They want our freedom. Or like, what the Muslims hate? They hated our freedom. You know, I mean, like everything is around. But these underlying, what you're talking about, this production, you know, every country has to produce. And how is that production organized? It's organized socially but privately appropriated, you know. And all this stuff, we do have to dig into this. We got to understand this, that it's not just, you know, Central African Republic where people are really suffering, but in all these other countries as well. And brings us to this point where, you know, that's what it leads back to. The world is a horror, but it doesn't have to be this way. You know, I mean, it really is profound, and I think it's up to us to really like, I mean, this is really what internationalism is about, you know. And there's such a tendency to look at your own country, or look at how the social safety net here has been stripped away from people, and not even thinking about, I mean, I run into people all the time that say, well, in Europe, they actually give people this stuff, but no, it's being stripped away there too. And that's the cause for a lot of these rebellions that we don't hear about, but we should know about. Anyway.
Yeah.
Nothing good can come out of this. What would be least bad?
Well, I don't say nothing good can come out of it. Well, no, actually, I'm not a lawyer, but I am going to act like one right now. No, just kidding. Actually, I said nothing good can come out of the current configuration. So, in other words, if things are fought out on the terms that they are being fought out on now, which is, no, we want to join Russia, all these people are against us as Russians, versus, no, we want to control Ukraine, we want to join the EU, we're Democrats, you people are whatever. If it's on those terms and under the wing and the leadership of the capitalists, nothing good can come. But there's not, but you know, one thing that happens in crises is that it shocks people and jolts people and potentially awakens people. But you need intervention you need revolutionary communist intervention to clarify for people why things are happening and what to do about them. So if there were ways to get revolution and this manifesto into Ukraine, and the people that are, you know, being so, or Czechoslovakia, or Slovakia and the Czech Republic. There's 3 of them now, isn't it? Isn't it Slovenia? Is it? Oh, into 2. Oh, something different. All right. Okay. Into those countries, you know. And at the same time, so there's that ideological component, and I want to refer people to this magazine, Demarcations, that we just had a celebration of. It's a theoretical magazine, and it has a big summary of the Arab uprisings and the need for leadership. Remember, these were oh no, we don't need leadership. We're a leaderless movement. all that means is somebody else is going to lead it, and that they're going to be the military or the Muslim Brotherhood. Someone bad is going to lead it. It's a harmful concept, you know, because you're ceding leadership and you're ceding state power to people that aren't going to do anything good with it. And one of the points it makes in the magazine is that even a relatively small number of communists can make a huge difference in this kind of a situation. In other words, if they look at the Chinese Communist Party started out with what, 21 people, and they were inspired by the Russian Revolution. Think of what happened there. You know, what if some intellectuals in Kiev or in Prague or wherever started engaging? And look, there's going to be an argument where we understand. You're not, oh, gee, I read Bob Avakian, I believe everything he's ever said. No, it's a, you know, this is an intellectual argument and engagement. And even if dozens here and there began to get on that tip, then that could really change things. The other thing that can change things and not leave things in the current configuration is if the masses of people in this country get involved in a movement for revolution, and even more broadly, rising up against the profound injustices in this country, whether it be mass incarceration or the oppression of women. I mean, look, this country goes around the world saying it's a defender of human rights. Meanwhile, black youth are murdered with impunity. You know, so if there's a visible revolutionary or radical mass opposition in this country, this can inspire people globally, just like what happened in Tunisia and Egypt inspired people globally. And this can also be true in terms of opposing U.S. aggression around the world. This is one of the things that strengthens reaction, is when people in Islamic countries or other countries are getting bombs rained on them, and they look at the U.S. and there's 20 people out protesting something. That's fucked up, you know? So those are some ways the situation can change. But you're right. You're right if the configuration and the forces involved don't change. You're right. But these things can change, and I think that's where people like all of us come in. Even if we're emailing articles to people we know in other countries, or in, you know, stimulating debate and engagement about these things. This can be a big, you know, donate to Bob Avakian Everywhere or to RevCom so that website can reach out to people all around the world. I mean, it's interesting, this article, this Demarcations magazine has big articles from communists in Mexico and Iran that are advocating this new synthesis, you know. So it's a very, you know, very important debates going on internationally over this. Anyway, yeah, go ahead in the back.
I just want sort of, it's worth thinking about sort of I mean, one thing I was thinking about in your presentation, you made the point that the U.S. has pursued a policy since the breakup of the Soviet Union that no one in the world would be able to rise up and rival and challenge the U.S. in the way that the Soviet Union did in the period that it existed, at least the later part of it, right? But I mean, I think that's an important point, that, and it's an expression that, but what happened, at least in part, in these events in the Ukraine, is that the underlying tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and Western Europe and the Soviet Union jumped out in a way that I don't think anybody fully anticipated. And that, I mean, I was just reading something today where they said neither Obama nor Putin understood how sharp this was going to be. Okay, so, but what you see, it isn't like, I mean, the point I want to make is this: it isn't like Germany's going for Ukraine because they're going to turn a quick profit off a country which is essentially an economic basket case, right? Nor is Russia trying to hold on to it exactly because there's a lot of quick cash there. The point is more strategic. It's more, if they get it, we're fucked, okay? And we're going to actually go down around some things. And that reveals how much underlying tension there is in the world around these questions. And I think it surprised me, and I think it surprised a lot of people, how explosive this is. Europe in the 20th century had World War twice. People lined up behind their own capitalists, marched off. 60 million died in World War II, right? And this is the same tension that gave rise to that, in essence. And so, I mean, what good could come out of it is that people could sum up, we're not going to do this again, okay? I mean, that's part of it, right? And I mean, to do that requires a lot of things, and I'm not going to repeat all the things you said, which are all important. But I just think it's like, this is what jumped out here, is this. And you know, the youth in the Ukraine don't have a clue about what's in operation, and they're marching. They're marching behind something that's very, very bad. So there we go. I mean, we've got to figure out what we can do to change all that. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Just following on what you say, Barry. So what's the point of actually invading Crimea? You know, why particularly that place? Like, is that giving them an upper hand on everything? Like, or is there like oil or gas pipelines coming there? Why that place? Exactly that place. You know, because I mean, like they've taken the, you know, they anticipated all of the other imperialist countries on a military basis. You know, like they went for the military capturing of these places.
Well, you want to go back to that first slide? Well, Crimea. This is Crimea. You might have come in after we. This is what Russia is reportedly in control of, and I think the most immediate thing. And look, exactly what their strategy is. I mean, I'm not sitting in those meetings where they're figuring that out, you know. But first, on a basic level, they're going to maintain control of this for military reasons, because this is the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. But I also think that this is also probably a signal that they may be willing to take broader control in eastern Ukraine, number one. Number two, to warn, to basically, it's a shot across the bow. I mean, Putin said today, I want to resolve this peacefully. And he probably would like to on his terms. You know, Obama probably would as well on his terms. It's probably a shot across the bow of the West that you people better back off, because what Russia sees happening is a major move that crosses one of their red lines. And they've made very clear to the U.S. that, you know, okay, we're not going to fight about Poland and Slovakia, but we are. You get right on our border, that's a different thing. That's a different matter for us. And the U.S. knew this, yet, you know, acted in a very brazen, in a lot of ways, provocative ways. This is how the U.S. is, oh, no, we're just going about our business, and all of a sudden this guy invades Crimea. My God, what happened? See, they like to start the movie at the point where the other guy does something, and then they can point at that. And they don't, show you how the movie began, you know, and what happened leading up to that, you know. Oh, 9/11. Why would anyone hate America? Oh my God, this is absurd, you know. You know, and I think there are probably a lot of other. So I think the message here is that Russia feels it has vital interests in not just controlling this, but also sending a signal globally and to its own population that it is not going to be trampled on. You know, and these things about sending messages and what is conveyed and all this is really has a lot of meaning in the world of imperialist geopolitics. You look at a movie like The Godfather or some Sopranos. I mean, this is that writ large. In other words, if other powers sense weakness, they're emboldened, and they're talking about this in the U.S. This is why this thing could get out of control, because right now people like McCain and some of these other people are saying, you know why this happened? Because of the feckless leadership of Barack Obama, especially around Syria, when he claimed he had a red line and then he didn't enforce it. And look, there's a tendency among the social democratic left to say, oh, these are just the neocons. They always just want war. No, these are just other imperialist strategists arguing real points. If you're an imperialist, I mean, it's nothing good for humanity. But this is a serious matter of imperialist statecraft. Are you going to convey to the world? This is why a big reason they went into Afghanistan, they went into Iraq rather after September 11th. They had objectives in Iraq, but they also, Henry Kissinger said, bombing a few caves in Afghanistan is not going to restore U.S. credibility. We got to do something big here and show the world that you don't mess with the United States. They're real. You're going to get it if you do, you know. And so that's partly what is at play here, you know, and what makes this so. You know, this guy Stephen Cohen said, "Look, if this is allowed to stand, then what you have is the West right up against Russia's borders." And from now on, you have the threat of war hanging over you, because if there's some provocation on the border, if some ultra-nationalist Ukrainian or from someplace else does something provocative, you could all of a sudden be in a crisis, you know. And I think that's... I think so. There is the Crimea. There's a particularity of the Crimea because this is Russia's warm water port. And if let's put it this way: if Russia lost control of Crimea, it'd be a gigantic geopolitical defeat, I believe. And in terms of Russia's global stature, and Russia is, been trying to reassert that, right? And I mean, look, this is the shifting tides of I was reading today that Russia was really buoyed by high energy prices, but commodity prices have softened. So now Russia has its own economic difficulty, and there's even, I've read things that people are saying, well, part of the reason Putin's so concerned is he doesn't want Russia to implode. I'm not saying Russia's the same as Ukraine, but I think, and I thought Barry's point was the sharpness of this. You don't realize that the volcano's going to happen until it happens. Is a good, is a very good point. But I just keep going back to this thing. Wow, here we are again. 100 years after World War I started. 1914, you know. Yeah, go ahead.
I thought the point you made about if the U.S. starts any kind of moves, that people should be out there. And that's one way to project, I think, a whole alternative view of the whole world and what the potential is by getting out there with calling out the crimes, but also the big RevCom, you know, .us signs that can be projected around the world. That's one thing. But I was just thinking that when these kind of things, these kind of crises happen, a lot of ugliness does jump out. We have to understand that's because it's the ugliness of the world, the horror that the world is. But if by bringing forward what's actually true and who's behind these things, like I mean, there's definitely this tendency for, you said people have a lot of fear and stuff like that. That's like paralyzing people and things. And there's this whole tendency to get sucked in by, you know, I mean here, look what the U.S. is doing. They're going all over the Middle East with their drone warfare, killing people, you know, with impunity and stuff like this. It's unbelievable. But we have to, I think that's the importance of digging into these questions in terms of our, you know, what has actually been brought forward with our project and what the potential is with this new synthesis and things like that. And anyway, that's about what I wanted to say.
Well, and you know, just the other thing quickly on that, the RCP has a whole strategy for revolution, which a component of it is identifying key fault lines or concentrations of social contradictions in which are rooted in the very nature of the system, that the system not only cannot change, but are very intense contradictions, and to organize people to fight the power, transform the people for revolution around those. And right now, these initiatives, International Women's Day is coming up. There's a global war on women. You know, this is half of humanity, and it's very intense in this country. And so there's a great urgency to rally women of many, you know, different views to fight for basic rights, like the right to abortion, and oppose pornography and the degradation of women, violence against women, and so on. And if you rallied millions of people around that, that too really contributes to changing the political terrain. We just got done with Hoodie Day, the anniversary of Trayvon Martin's murder, and there were protests in 20 different cities. I mean, there's a very sharp fault line around the oppression of black people that is, no, we are not in a post-racial society, you know. There's very intense oppression. And we're talking about the ugliness and all the things that happen in an economic crisis. There's a huge economic crisis. The economic stresses in this country take another lurch downward. You can bet there are going to be racist mobs being directed to take this out against black people, you know. And it's you know, so these are other means of doing what you're talking about. You know, and there's a whole conscious strategy around this. And if you're looking at revolution every week, you're seeing the, you know, what's happening in the world, but also the different efforts to repolarize the political and ideological situation, you know. Yeah.
I just wanted to highlight the last point that the point that you raised about International Women's Day. Because one of the things that is has the globalization, one of the things that globalization has devastated, especially the region that, you know, she was talking about, is women in that region. Women that actually who were liberated in the Soviet Union revolution, and now is the greatest market for the prostitution all over the world. It is very significant to be able to actually somehow highlight that in this International Women's Day, to stand with those sisters and others who actually should fight and would fight against that shit, you know, in one way or the other. We figure it out that that itself is a very significant force that actually could bring, you know, you were saying there's a lot of fear, a lot of not knowing what direction to go. But this is direction, it adds much more responsibility on our shoulder. Last week we were talking to some Chinese students, you know, we were thinking, oh my God, what the fuck, they have no idea about the Great Cultural Revolution. Here it is, another thing that, you know, how much humanity needs the new synthesis that we're talking about. I cannot, you know.
They have to come to revolution books to learn about the Chinese Revolution. They told us that.
Well, just a question. Maybe we could talk about it afterwards too. But right before I left for this program, watching CBS News, and apparently there's a whole nother round of fighting in Kiev tonight against the new government. I mean, and armed fighting. It looks like the whole city is in flames. The new government's police are shooting down the protesters. So I didn't know whether you had watched.
No, I didn't know that. I had not heard this.
Yeah, and I was kind of wondering if anybody had any clue of. I mean, a very volatile, very quickly changing situation, but and what role? I know there's a lot of like neo-Nazi, all that kind of forces within that, how that is playing and maybe spinning out of their control. I don't know, but anyway, it's moving very quickly.
Go ahead, Gary.
I was just wondering, you know, back in the day during the Cold War, I understood that the Ukraine was really nuked up. Do you know when the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, did it lock down and take control over those nukes, or do you know what the situation is regarding that?
Yeah, I think there was an agreement where they denuclearized. I believe this you may know. My understanding is there was some agreement after the collapse of the Soviet Union where Ukraine did have a nuclear force.
Yeah.
But they don't any longer, is my understanding.
Yeah, I kind of have a vague memory.
Well, yeah, Chernobyl, but he's talking about nuclear weapons, right? No, that is where the worst, one of the worst nuclear things happened exactly in Chernobyl. But yeah, that's a good question because look at Pakistan, yikes. Of course, look at Russia and America, yikes. So, Israel, yeah, anyway. Okay, well, thanks everybody, and like I say, I'd encourage everybody to get on the Revolution Books email list and the RevCom, and Gary has cards, and grab a calendar and a paper and whatever else you want to grab. Thank you.